Hi, I'm Chris Sangster, and welcome back to the studio. Today, I want to take you inside the process of mixing a live album. There are different challenges we face when dealing with tracks that were recorded during a live performance versus those recorded in a studio. And while my baseline mixing process remains the same, there are some special techniques that I used on this live album that I don't typically get to use on studio recorded songs. And I want to share those with you today. This album is by my lifelong friend and mega talented guitarist, Raleigh Heckel. Seriously, he could play Eruption when we were like 13. It was recorded at Richmond Music Hall in Richmond, Virginia on September 20th, 2025, and the album was just released this week. Raleigh makes instrumental guitar-led music that spans from ambient to reggae to rock. And we've worked on many projects together in the past, but this is the first time he has put out a live album. Very exciting project to be a part of that included a lot of unique challenges. Let's dive into the process. Let's start by looking at the original stems that I received and how my setup for this project deviated slightly from my normal mixing workflow. So these are all of the tracks that I got to mix. Essentially, all of the mics and lines that were running to the live mixing board just recorded for the entire runtime of the set. So all the songs are contained in these long regions. In addition to the board stems, I also got a stereo microphone recording that an audience member captured. And this ended up being super useful to both increase the ambience of the room and to help bolster the applause and crowd reactions. I did have to slightly adjust this room mic so that it was synced up properly with the rest of the board stems. I did this by placing it right next to the snare mic in the main window and then zooming in to a point where there was a clear snare hit I could see on the waveform of the room mic. I then shifted the room mic region in time to match it precisely to the transient of the snare track. My next step was simply to organize these stems. Organization is key to all mixing, but it's especially important when working on a project of this scale. So to start, I just went through and marked out where all of the songs began with session markers and color-coded things so I could just have a better overview of where everything was in the session. Once that was done, I made a new project alternative for the first mix. In that alternative, I trimmed the regions down so that I was working with just the first song. Then I mixed the first song fully. We'll come back to some specifics of the mix in a moment, but the thing I did very differently on this project was once I was done with the first mix and Raleigh had signed off on it, I imported all of the plugins and settings from that mix back into the first project alternative with the full-length regions. Let me show you how that works. To do this, in the original alternative, we go to File, Import, Logic Projects. Then we choose this same project we're working on, but the alternative for the final mix of the first song. Then in the project import window to the right, we select all of the tracks and aux tracks, and then use the tick boxes to choose what we want to import from that session. Very importantly, we do not want to import the content, that is the regions on the track. We already have the original regions that we want to use in this session, so we leave that one off. But we do want to import the plugins on the tracks, the sends, and the routing. But we do not want to include the automation because automation will need to change song to song. And this is the big advantage of this method. It allows us to bring over exactly what we need, but have a clean slate for things like the automation. Once everything except content and automation are selected for all the tracks and aux tracks, we hit import. And then we get all of these new tracks in our session. We then simply drag the regions down to their correct track, and now we have our template imported into our original session with all the songs. And then I can start each new mix from this template. Because the player, the instruments, the mics, and the room did not change at all song to song, I could use this first mix as a template to get a head start on the next mix. Usually, I do not recommend this template-based approach because every song is its own unique challenge which requires its own settings and mix decisions. But with a live album, because so many elements stay the same song to song, and because a cohesive, immersive sound from beginning to end is so important, I find that it's a big benefit to use that first mix as a template. It not only allows me to mix the subsequent songs faster, but it aids in building that sonic experience of listening to a full concert start to finish. However, the big thing to note about using this template-based approach is that it is not just set it and forget it. The specific settings of the first song are just a starting point for the second song, and everything from the volume to the EQ to the effects all have to be examined and dialed in appropriately for the next song. So that's how things differ from a setup perspective. What else changes when mixing a live album? Perhaps the biggest thing for me is just a mindset shift. When we're recording in a studio environment, we have so much control over the sound of things. Not only can the acoustics be controlled, but we can do as many takes as we like. We can comp, change out instruments, rearrange, the list goes on and on. But at a live show, it's one take in a room that was built for an audience, not a microphone. So when mixing a live recording, it's all about removing the bad, highlighting the good, and accepting what you can't change. For example, at some level, you have to embrace the bleed between microphones. There's just no getting around it entirely. But we can do some things to reduce the messiness, like muting microphones when they're not necessary, or sometimes gate plugins can work. And I did use one on the snare, but when the bleed is this extreme, I actually much prefer to cut regions and mute them where they aren't needed. I certainly did this on the toms in the traditional tom muting method, but I also did this on the guitars, on the bass, on the overhead tracks when those instruments were not playing. And then when all of the instruments are playing together, I used EQ to separate the instruments as much as possible, but leaned into the fact that this is a live performance and the bleed that remains will help the sound retain that live feel. However, there are certain issues that are completely fixable, and I did everything I could to eliminate those types of problems. For example, several times throughout the performance, there was some type of static pop in the recording. It tended to affect all of the mics and lines simultaneously, and it may have been faulty cables or the board getting bumped accidentally, but either way, it was pretty brutal sounding. For this and other noise problems, I had to use iZotope RX. It is really the best tool in the game for any audio repair work like this, and it's super easy to integrate with Logic Pro. To do this, I used the default editor function in Logic Pro, which, if you've never heard of, is really handy and only takes a few seconds to set up. To set it up, we go to the Logic Pro menu, Settings, and Audio, then navigate to the File Editor tab. And right down here at the bottom, we can choose our default external editor. You could choose any audio application you like, Melodyne, Restem, or in my case, the iZotope RX editor. I started by chopping out the small section on the regions where the noise occurred. Then I saved this new region as a new audio file and named it with RX at the end of the file name. This is so we only get this small section that we need into RX and not that full crazy long file. That way we can easily revert to the original if we needed to. This process is destructive to the original file, so it is important to always save a new file first. Then all I had to do to load this region into RX is select it and hit Shift-W on my keyboard. And there's our bass region right in RX. So RX has tons of great tools to fix a whole host of issues, but for this specific static popping, I used two different tools. First, let's zero in on the first place where that noise happens. Then I'll simply click and drag with my mouse to draw a selection around this group of pops. And since there are very short clicky sounds, we'll start by running the D-click algorithm. And because this is a full spectrum click, we will put the frequency skew in the middle and leave the other settings as they are and hit render. That definitely removed the clickiness, but now there's a lot of empty space that still sounds wrong. To fill in those gaps, we will use the spectral repair tool. Again, we start by selecting the area, and then with the spectral repair tool, we want to use the partials and noise tab. In here, we can choose where the tool pulls audio from in order to fill in the gaps. And since we want to essentially extend this note, we'll put the before after weighting all the way to before. We can then turn the length up to select this whole note and then hit render. And there we have a completely smoothed out repair. I then repeated this process for the other moments in the bass where there were pops. Then to bring it back into Logic, all we have to do is hit save inside of RX and it automatically transfers over to Logic because it changed the underlying audio file. Then I repeated this process for all of the other tracks and eventually I completely eliminated the issue. Next, let's look a little closer at the drums on this project because this is where a lot of work came in. I already mentioned using the gates and muting some of the regions, but I took things a lot further to craft the drum tone on this record. For starters, I decided to add samples to bolster the sound of the kick and snare. Now, this might seem a bit like cheating in the context of a live album, but I deliberately chose samples that enhanced the natural sound of the kick and snare instead of changing them altogether. And to do this, I used Logic Pro's drum replacement tool. By selecting the kick track and hitting Ctrl D, we can quickly create a MIDI pattern that exactly matches the recorded kick drum. We choose kick as the instrument and use doubling mode since we'll be adding to the existing kick sound, not replacing it entirely. Then by moving the threshold slider, we can make sure the MIDI is triggering every time the kick hits. It's best to zoom in a bit to see exactly where the MIDI notes are being created, and in my experience, using this slider just gets you in the right ballpark, but it's always good practice to go through the song after the MIDI track has been created and make sure that every hit has triggered properly. Then the best part about this is we can use whatever plugin we want to create the drum sound. Instead of loading a sample into Sampler or using Drum Kit Designer, for the kick and snare, I use the Slate SSD drums. And another little tip when using the drum replacement tool in Logic, although it does put the MIDI on the correct note, at least for most drum software instruments, the velocity is always a little on the low side for me. So I just select all of the notes and slide the velocity up to around 90. This makes it plenty loud, but retains the differences in velocity that match the original kick. Here's the drum kit without the kick and snare samples. And with them. Definitely a bolstering to the sound, and I made sure to keep these same samples in every single song to keep the drum tone consistent for the whole album. But the sample replacing didn't end there for this project. I had to use a very creative use of sampling to solve a big problem on several of these tunes. Let me show you. One of the biggest issues I had to deal with on this project was the rattle of the snare drum. The metal snares on the bottom of the drum were sympathetically resonating from the sound coming out of the guitar amplifiers. This was causing an insane amount of unpleasant noise, especially in the overhead mic. Hear all that high swishy stuff? Yeah, super messy. And the best way to solve this was to apply a high cut filter to the overheads. But that totally killed the hi-hat sound. And since there was no close hi-hat mic recorded, this was my only source for a good hi-hat sound in the mix. So I got super creative. I decided to try to sample replace the hi-hat. But since my overhead mic was so splashy in the high end, I couldn't use that track to properly trigger just the hi-hats. So I turned to another source, the room mic. This didn't have the snare rattle in it like the overhead, but it did have too much of the other instruments in it to use to trigger just the hi-hat. So what I did is make a copy of it, rolled off all of the low end with a brick wall low cut, Then I found two resonant frequencies where the hi-hat was living and boosted the heck out of them. And this gave me the perfect track to use to trigger the hi-hat performance. So then I just used the drum replacement tool to create a MIDI performance to trigger a new clean hi-hat sample. Oh, but the fun wasn't over yet. Because in this song, the drummer was doing a mixture of open and closed hi-hats, I had to manually go into the MIDI and change the closed hi-hats to open hi-hats when he played the different style of hat. I was then able to use that high cut filter on the overhead track to get rid of the snare rattle. I also still retained some of the kick, tom, and snare on the overhead, and then of course added in the clean hi-hat sound from the MIDI track. I did also add a bit more reverb to the drums as well as to the guitars and synths. Just because this was recorded live in a club doesn't mean that we shouldn't add extra reverb. I added a room reverb that was similar to the natural ambience of the space to enhance it, and I also added a bigger reverb to the snares, toms, and keyboards to fill in the gaps and create more impact. But maybe the most important tool I used on this entire album was Sound Radix Auto-Align. If you aren't familiar with this plugin, it automatically phase aligns tracks within your mix. Typically, I will use this plugin when I'm mixing a multi-mic'd drum kit to keep all of the kit mics phase aligned. But since all of these tracks were recorded on stage together, I actually used Auto-Align on every single track. One of the things I absolutely love about Auto-Align is how simple it is to set up. I did this as one of the very first steps in my mix to get everything phase aligned from the get-go. All I had to do was put an instance of Auto-Align as the first plugin on every track. I just hit align, then play through the song start to finish. And then Auto-Align does its thing, aligning the phase relationship between all of the tracks. Check out how much more punch and clarity there already is in the sound with just this phase alignment applied. That stuff is fun and creative and was great to get to experiment with, but there is one simple tool that I simply could not have done this project without, and that is automation. Automation is always one of the most important tools when it comes to mixing, and that is doubly true for mixing a live album. Because the players are moving around the stage, because the energy is ebbing and flowing, and because there are so many other variables at play in a live performance, keeping the song full and balanced at every moment just requires more use of automation. And this isn't just traditional automation either. On several songs, Raleigh would turn different pedal effects on and off throughout the song. And in these occasions, I would actually cut the region when the effects changed and create a new track for that section. That way I could affect each different tone within the song appropriately. So just look how much automation is going on in this mix. Obviously, we have plenty of volume automation, both to mute tracks when they aren't needed and to make sure everything is properly balanced at every moment in the song. But I've also automated reverb and delay effects to have the appropriate amount in different song sections or to create special effects, like this big burst of reverb on the snare before the last chorus. I've also used plenty of EQ automation. We can see on the lead guitar, I actually radically changed the EQ for the final section to account for different masking issues that were present when the full band was playing full out. Let's listen to this build up and transition into the last chorus with and without all of the automation. Just a lot more balance, clarity, and life with the automation. The final important part of this project was making sure everything flowed properly together so that when you listen from start to finish, it sounds like you were at the concert. This was part of the mastering process, which for an album or EP, I like to do in a separate session where I bring in a bounce of every mix. And it was actually a combination of how I bounced the mixes and how I set them up in this mastering session that ensured the songs flowed smoothly into one another. There were some moments of banter and dead time between songs that Raleigh wanted to cut out, so in each mix session, I had to make sure there was a natural sounding entrance at the beginning and a natural applause and tail off at the end. I bounced the mixes starting precisely on the entrance of the band, but always included a little extra applause or audience chatter at the end. That way I could do something a little unique in the mastering session. To make the songs flow one into the other, I would cut a little piece of the end of the song, that little extra audience tone, and layer it over the top of the beginning of the next song. I had this extra tone and the next song grouped together in a track stack, and I put my mastering processing on the aux track to ensure this layer didn't cause clipping. This extra audience sound smoothed out the transition points and made them sound very natural, even if there was a large section that I cut out of the original recording, because it allowed something from the end of one song to continue on to the beginning of the next song, so your ear naturally hears a smooth transition. So there we go. All the special tricks I used in Logic Pro to make this live recorded album sound like a properly finished live album. Please go give this project a listen. It is available right now wherever you get your music, and the direct link to check it out is in the description box below the like button. And if you have a song that is in need of a professional mix and master, whether it was recorded live or in your home studio, hit the link right below Raleigh's link to schedule a mix with me. My books are currently open with a few slots still available for this month and next. As always, leave a comment if you have any questions. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you at the studio next time. Thanks.